All right. Hello, everyone. We'll probably have some more people filtering in through the next few minutes. That's totally fine. My name is Carissa. I am a staff member here at UCCS. I am the chairperson of a new group that we have called Bloom. It's Blossoming, Learning, Overcoming Opportunities, and Mastery. And we're focused on youth incarceration outreach, and then also working on outreach here at our campus community, because right now it's faculty and staff. We will probably have some student opportunities in just a bit. And this is actually our very first event. We're doing a kickoff here. Excuse me. And I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Ryan Forbes. He's coming up from Longmont today and is one of our external partners for Bloom. He has 2 comics published now at waywordpress.com. That was in your email if you wanted to download the newest comic for free. He is at the Longmont Recovery Cafe and does the Shakedown podcast. So I'm going to keep my spiel a little short. My last thing is there's a few small snacks, and if you need the restroom, it's just out those doors and to the right, or my right. So awesome. Everybody, let's welcome Ryan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming out today. And basically, really, the first thing I wanted to say is I just really wanted. I've been working with a lot of people, a lot of staff, a lot of faculty, a lot of students out here, and I just wanted to say thank you. And I've just been totally impressed by everyone here at UCCS. It's been a really fun experience putting this together, and I'm really excited to give this presentation, and hopefully everyone can get a lot out of it. And the next thing, part of it too, is you might have been able to tell from the title, is that I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of different things, and I totally expect questions to come up. And I know we've got people online too, and Chris is going to help with that. So if you have any questions or concerns or any clarification or anything, please don't feel free to raise your hand, and I can go in and clarify, because I'm going into a whole bunch of different topics for this, and I'm happy to clarify, and we've definitely got the time for that today. And yeah, so with that said, and also I'm going to have some time at the end for if you want to have deeper conversation about any one of the topics as well. So, which brings me to who am I and why am I here? As Carissa said, I just got done finished with a restorative justice graphic novel, which was a main project I've worked on for the past 3 years. And before that, my main career was as a software developer. I got a degree in computer science from Montana State University, and I worked in that for about a decade. And that career was working in startup companies and Fortune 500 companies. I worked at ski.com, and I also worked at the company that basically any place you got a ski ticket from, or any place where you see the gates open up for you when you go skiing, I worked on that software. And then I also worked for the Department of Defense, and I worked on their communications, so I got to see some of that too. So I had a bunch of different experience in that, and that became my sole focus after a long while. And part of what put a pause on that was when that became my focus, I ignored my family, my friends, and even my own health, and because I was just focused on what's the next best thing for my career. And that ended up in me causing a crash that cost another person their life. And then I I was in Texas at the time. I got a 10-year prison sentence plus 10 years of probation, but the sentence itself the judge in the county I was in, because it was intoxicated manslaughter, the county I was in, they were very strict about any intoxicated offenses. So the sentence ended up getting very complicated. And he wanted to kind of like make his own example of me in a weird way. So what ended up coming of that was this community service aspect of the sentence. So what was on one of my restrictions for the sentence was this 400 hours of community service. And he said that the community service needed to be public speaking at schools. And and he meant like elementary, middle school, high schools is kind of what he was thinking. But the thing was when I got an interstate compact to come out to be here when I got released from prison, to come out and be here with my family. And when probation saw this condition here in Colorado, they're like, you can't do this. This is not a way we can't count you. First off, as a felon, we're not letting you into schools to go do this. And two, you're not, this is not a way we're gonna count your community service hours. And so the interstate compact works with the laws of both states. So they had to figure out some sort of compromise so I could fill out these 400 hours. So for a while, they were trying to figure out what would do this, what could actually fulfill these hours. And so they were like, well, what are you doing right now? And at the time, I was months out of prison. I was living with my mom in Niwot, Colorado. And if you don't know where Niwot, Colorado, don't worry, most people don't. So I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I'm just trying to get out on my feet out of prison, trying to figure out. But the one project I do have going was that. That is a comic that I published with my friend who also had just gotten out of prison. His name was Malone, and he spent 30 years in Texas prisons. He was there starting in the 90s when they were wanted to lock everybody up. They still kind of do in Texas, but he got locked up as a teenager, and one of the things that he knew he wanted to do was to draw comics, and he had 30 years of art just piled up. And he had this nearly finished comic just sitting there on copy paper, and he didn't know what to do with. And I said, I had been wanting to do a comic book with him since I was writing comics and he was drawing comics, and he does some amazing artwork. And I said, we need to do a comic. How can we make this happen? And he said, well, I need to publish this other one first, and then I can do our comic. And so I was like, the one he had just needed lettering and to be sent to a printer. And so I'm like, all right, I'll do it. I'll make that happen. So I had to learn lettering, which was a lot, putting letters on artwork was a lot more time consuming than I expected. And then learning about printers, which I will get into as I get into the publishing side of this talk. But that was what I was doing. So I was just wrapping up publishing this comic. So when probation heard about this, they were like, well, we're going to refer to you to our Restorative Justice Department. And when Restorative Justice Department heard about this, they're like, well, what do you think about doing a restorative justice graphic novel? And the reason they were asking that is because the Restorative Justice Department at that time was doing some really interesting stuff. They were doing they were doing restorative justice music, restorative justice paintings, restorative justice videos and plays and things like that to tact, and it's a big part because they're trying to act out people's stories so that victims and perpetrators and everyone can get their hurt stories heard, basically like they can initiate a healing process between everyone involved in crimes. And so I guess I need to bring a little summary here about what is restorative justice. Restorative justice, as opposed to what, like the standard criminal justice system that you have in our, like right now, like when you get arrested, you go to court and all that, it's adversarial. It's the prosecution versus the defense, and you're trying to fight to see how much time you get, how severe the sentence it is. Restorative justice is about how can we heal every person who's involved and get things, and just because the assumption is everyone's been damaged by the crime that's been done, by the harm that's been done, how do we actually heal them? So the Boulder County Restorative Justice Department was trying to incorporate art into that process. So that's when they came to me and they asked, well, what do you think about doing a restorative justice graphic novel? And I immediately said, not a good idea. I don't think that's great. I don't think that's gonna work. I think I can see a lot of problems with that. And also the idea was I was going to basically tell my story of killing someone, and then at the end, like have my apology that I never got to say to the victim and their family, because there was no restorative justice process in Texas. There was no aspect of that, and that's standard. In the adversarial process, you're not going to have an apology. You're not going to make that. That's not a standard process. So it's like this would be a way to have that apology out there. And I was like, it was a lot to take in. I was like, I don't think that's gonna work. So, but as we're talking about that, I'm thinking about what Malone and I talked about in prison, because in prison we actually studied comics. Like we enjoyed comics. We had piles of comics that we had gathered over decades, and we studied them. And Malone actually, one of his biggest things that he helped me to understand is that whereas most people buy a comic because they like Spider-Man, or they like Batman, or they like Gotham City, or they like DC, or they like Marvel, he's like, no. Most people don't like any of those things. What they like are really good writers and really good artists. And if you have those working on the comics, those will be the people those will be what you gravitate towards. And even if it's a character you don't really like, you may not like He-Man or Swamp Thing or something like that. Swamp Thing was an untouchable character for a very long time. It was an unpopular comic. People didn't like it. Then Alan Moore got a hold of it, and all of a sudden it was the most popular comic for most of the 90s. And then he introduced me to people like this. This is part of a panel from Brandon Graham. Brandon Graham would do things like have these settings like this where there's so much going on in the setting, there's so much detail in there that you could spend a half an hour looking at it and you still wouldn't see all the detail or all the little things happening in that scene. He would make puns everywhere so that there would be puns there would be advertisements that would be in itself a pun, like there would be a security device called the Later Gator, or there would be there's all sorts of or characters' names would be in themselves puns. And then he'd actually use word balloons as objects that became crucial that the characters use inside the story. which you could only do inside a comic or a graphic novel, which is something I ended up borrowing from him inside my graphic novel. And I did this, I ended up and then I learned from not just Brandon Graham, but other big artists and writers that I learned from. Like I said, there's Alan Moore with V for Vendetta, with these, which is an amazing storyline. I really love the idea of having incorporating revolution and everything into the storyline. There's Brian Michael Bendis, who made one of the most iconic Spider-Mans. And honestly, most people, when they think of a Spider-Man-like story, they're usually thinking of Brian Michael Bendis. And then art, one of my favorite artists is John Romita Jr., and that was someone I studied all the time when I was trying to draw my characters. And he also, that panel is from one of my favorite Black Panther storylines and everything that I've ever read. So those all showed me I learned from Inside with Malone that these things, it wasn't about necessarily the genre or the character or even necessarily the plot. It was about the storyteller and how they told the story that made it really interesting and powerful. So that made it interesting, and it would be an interesting challenge, and also be way better community service than spending 400 hours picking trash on the side of the highway. So that kind of sold me on, we're gonna make, doing this graphic novel and trying to make this happen. And so basically the graphic novel gets the green light, and we go, and that becomes my community service. I start tracking hours for making this community service graphic novel, and I'm working with Boulder County Community Service, mainly with there's Deb Witzel and another person a guy named Oliver, he's not on that team anymore. But Deb Witzel of 3 Stories Consulting was my biggest help throughout this process, persons who I had to end up going back to again and again and again. And we had to go through this whole process. And it was very important to have them on the process with me, and they knew that this was not going to be easy, that me going through and writing this story was not going to be an easy or light process. I was like, my main goal was about making it interesting. I wasn't even thinking about how this was going to affect me trying to write this down on paper. And they were like, no, you're gonna run into some issues. And I did. And the first issue kind of came up when I was trying to write about the actual crash, in the early pages. I was trying to figure out how I was going to depict it, what that scene was going to look like, and how that would end up. And then the next part was talking about when I actually got to the sentencing hearing, and which is the most throughout the actual process was the most emotionally charged event for me, my family, the victims, everyone involved. It was that sentencing hearing. And what ended up happening is, because I was working with this Restorative Justice team and we were able to talk about these issues, and they were when I was writing these, I got stuck. I did not know how to move on from there, but they encouraged me, they kept me going, and I was able to actually continue the writing, and these actually became the most impactful turning points of the story. And I'm really happy with how they turned out. And then eventually later on, as I was actually drawing the story, there were lots of points where I was realizing when taking this from storyboard to actual physical art, like the art wasn't going to translate the way it looked like in the storyboard, and we actually had to rewrite the story, and we actually had to change the whole ending of it. And then that became, we actually were able to make the ending, I feel like, have more of an impact than it would have if we had just made it the original intention, which was just me just saying I'm sorry at the end. And I'm very happy about that too, and it's also because I got to work with these people who have experience with this restorative justice process. So, storyboarding. This was a thing I had a lot of experience with, that started with in prison, and the way it actually started out was that, so a lot of the comics I read, they had, like in the graphic novel collections, they'd have storyboards in the back, and they were written just like screenplays. So you could see the screenplay in the back of the book, and I'd read them, and I'd get to see, and it was really interesting because you get to see the changes they made from the original storyboard to the finished product. And sometimes it was like little minor things, and you're like, why did they change that? And sometimes it was really major things, but it was like, you can see like, oh man, I'm really glad they made that giant shift, and it's really different. And I learned talking to Malone that like the storyboards were written, they're like addressed directly to the artist. Like, hey, we can do it this way, or the writer might give the artist a few options for like a panel or something like that. And so I didn't, when I first wrote my first storyboard, I didn't have an artist in mind or anything. What I was writing about was, I was reading a lot of DC comics, and my favorite character was Kyle Rayner, Green Lantern, and DC hates him for some reason. They really don't like him, and they really they don't want to put him in movies. They don't want to touch him, and anytime there's something bad happens, they'll make him the person who everything bad happens to. And so I decided that I'm going to write a storyline where you can see, like, look at what you have with this character. There's a lot you can do with him. So I wrote one of those storyboards just like I'd seen it in the back of the graphic novels, without having an artist in mind and without ever having like drawn a full comic myself. And then this was before I met Malone. And then when I met Malone, and he found out, because I didn't tell him directly, he found out I had this storyboard. He's like, I want to read what you wrote. I was like, oh, you don't like Green Lantern? He's like, it's fine, I'll read it anyway. Let's see what this thing is. And he read it, and he's like, this is great. You should just get rid of you should just make it not Green Lantern. Just make it your own character and just sell it yourself. And I'll get into why that's a really good idea later. He really loved the story. And then because I knew he was such a good artist, I'm like, why don't you draw some of the pages? And he tried, and then he came back to me and he's like, you know what, why don't you try and draw the pages and then see what happens? And I started to realize that I was doing way too much in the storyboards. I was putting unrealistic expectations on the artist. I was putting tons of panels, like on that Alan Moore thing. I was looking at one of the things I noticed right away when I put up that slide. He has like 9 panels in a page, but he also has like one's like just an extreme close-up and all this kind of stuff. And there's certain things he does, but he also has he does different. He like, it's also black and white, but he doesn't have a whole bunch of characters in each one of those panels. I was putting 8 panels on a page, and then throwing every character in the whole DC universe in those panels. And it was killing the artists. They were having to work overtime to draw all these things out. And so the next thing I did was, the next time I had a story idea, I just decided to try and see if I could put it directly into a comic. And I realized very quickly what I needed to do. I couldn't put too many characters in a scene unless I was doing it unless it was like a big splash or something. I needed to limit it to like 4 or 5 panels on a page, things like that. And also, now when I do my storyboards, I draw them. I don't write them anymore. They're not going to be, I don't write them like they're plays. I draw them like basically as stick figure comic books, so that I have the proportions, I can see the panels, and I can read them just like the comic book and then go from there. Still, like even when I was doing this graphic novel, I still had scenes where I had crammed too many people into a scene, or had put too much on a page, because I was really trying to, I'm like, this is what the pacing should be on a page. Like it should start with this beat and end with this beat. And then I was putting too much into there when I could do it at slightly a different speed. For understanding pacing and things like that in comics, I highly recommend Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. It's a great book on breaking down like when you can how you can you can take scenes, break them apart, and then pull out scenes and see how they affect your pacing and how it works. And a lot of people do that. They'll actually take a storyboard and actually just like cut it into the panels, and then they'll see what it looks like if they actually take away the squares or add other squares back in, and see how it reads and what it looks like. So I highly recommend anything on first, like as far as Scott McCloud, as far as like understanding how to like write a good story in comics. But yeah, those suggestions that Malone gave me about writing it myself and all that kind of stuff, that was like over a year-long period before I actually was taking the advice. At first, I was still trying to cram a whole bunch in. I was trying to get him to draw the comics. But I eventually took it, and I eventually made those things happen. But so I remember early on in this process, like just listening to other people was hard. So definitely, it's important. Listen to the feedback you're getting early on, and even though I was really like, if you can just do this or this, or if someone else can just do this for me, or like the practicing and doing it yourself really pays off in the end, so you can see how it works. So, so another thing. There were a lot of different motivations too that went into the book. Like when I was writing it, there was the restorative justice aspect that we had Boulder County Restorative Justice getting into. But another thing I had to keep in check, like that I constantly wanted to write into the book, was kind of like my strong activist mission statement, which is basically prisons are bad. They're bad, they shouldn't exist, and that I wanted to show how awful they were, and like kind of how my issues kind of with the current justice system. And when I was writing, one of the big issues that we were having was that Deb had to constantly do is like, what is the mission of this? It's about healing, it's not about you. But there was always in my mind as I was going through and writing the novel, it's about, like, I wanted to show focusing on punishment, like putting people in cages and having them as slaves, work as slaves, like while they're locked up, and then the people who die in prisons, the fact that like everyone here pays for a process that does not help prevent crime is not helpful. And that was kind of always on the back of my mind going through this. And that was, but it was a thing that, like I said, Deb and everyone was trying to keep in check when it was coming more to the part of how do we heal from this situation, how do we make this about healing? So, restorative justice. So one of the biggest things that we had to do to make this about, like, that she had to keep on wrangling with me about, was about phrasing, and I didn't understand. It was really hard for me to take on, and like I said, how much is my story, how much is this about me? And I honestly, it's not just, the whole thing is not just about me, and I really didn't want it to be. And the other part was, I had for like the first few months of working on the graphic novel, it was constantly, this is about an accident, this is about an accident, this is about an accident. And I had to, she's like, well, you need to start referring it to as a crash, because you need to accept that you caused it. And part of it, if it's an accident, then there's no one who caused it, whereas you caused a crash. And it's a hard, so like, even though I've never denied that I caused it, it was interesting that going through this process, like, I'm like learning that I'm even having to accept more of, like, take on more of the language, take on more of what happened as I'm going through and actually even drawing up this novel and learning to accept more of what happened. And to be honest, I was not ready, and it had to come in phases as I was going through it. So it's another reason, I'm understanding very much more as, like, how you can doing this restorative justice work through art, part of the power that comes with it. So why do a story about restorative justice? Why restorative justice at all? And as I mentioned, it's more about healing. It's about healing. One of the other systems of justice is called transformative justice, where you go through and you know, if someone steals something, you look at, well, are they able to get a job that actually pays them a living wage so that they don't have to steal? And that's where you transform a system that affected them beforehand to prevent the crime in the first place, and then you actually change that, which I also very strongly support. But even in that case, I feel like you still need a restorative justice aspect, because you still have to address the harm caused, and that's what restorative justice deals with. And one of the other great things is restorative justice doesn't even have to be about justice. It can be, we have a restorative justice group in Longmont that will mediate office conflicts. They'll mediate youth groups. They'll go to schools and deal with conflicts within a school, and it brings everyone together, and it opens everyone up. Like, it opens a pathway of conversation so that everyone is listening, responsive, and getting on the same page. And it's all about, it's not about saying this person did this, it's more about how do we heal from this thing that affected everyone, and who did it affect, and who's not getting hurt, and how do we give them a voice. And if you want more information about it, it just so happens that tomorrow night we're having a big talk with the campus police and student moderators and student panelists and other people and we have a really great moderator that Carissa found, and we will be talking about different ways to deal with crime in general. So definitely you can stop by tomorrow night for that and hear about all the different ways different types of justice and kind of hear about different opinions, and we'll be discussing, getting different ideas about it, and also we'd love to hear everyone's feedback and feel about what their feelings are and opinions, and especially I know this campus has also recently been through a whole lot, so I know there's probably a lot of thoughts, and opinions on the matter as well. And also, if you want to know more about restorative justice things too, as Krista said at the beginning, the graphic novel, you can get it right now on for free online, and also if you like, I have a crowdfunding campaign if you would like a print version as well. So, and as I was starting to say, why art and restorative justice? So the biggest part of restorative justice, honestly, is that storytelling aspect. And sometimes it doesn't come from the, just from what happened. It has to be from people being able to tell their stories. And sometimes it is very hard to tell it directly, and sometimes there will never be a time where you will get, the victim and the perpetrator, or whoever, like the people who have been affected, or who right next to each other and talking to each other face to face. That may never happen. Just like in my situation, or even if they start on a restorative justice process, there might be reasons why they can't be in the same room together. Just COVID is a great example, where there might be a reason why you can't just get everyone in the room. And there's also, it's a different process, and sometimes, I, from the beginning, was very willing to admit what I had done, and that's not always going to be the case. And art is a very powerful way to get people to start to have empathy in times where they may not have empathy before, and maybe see things in a different light where they could not relate before. And so like I said, people need to relate to the loss they had to others, taking responsibility. And also the biggest part, and the part that I didn't touch on, it's when you have art or a story and you make it external, one of the biggest things, I know for me personally, and I think for a lot of victims as well, is that if there's meaning, if you can give what happened meaning, it helps everyone through the healing process. For me, being able to go, for me, my whole meaning throughout all of this, the prison, everything, my meaning from this is trying to make sure that no one goes through the same process that I went through and has to learn the lessons that I learned the way I learned them. And my hope is that no one loses a child the way I caused another family to lose a child. And that's getting meaning from what happened. And I feel like that's a big part of what comes from the restorative justice process. If you can actually do that, if you can actually pull meaning from it, then it's huge. It really, I feel like that's a huge source of the healing there. All right, so publishing for the comic book process. I've got 2 published comics. One is just online, one is one that I've done, one is print only. For Warp Ranger, I did it in print. It was I did first edition 300 issue print, and that was sold in comic book shops, and we sold it in conventions, and at in-person events. And we learned a lot from doing that. So one thing we learned is the biggest part that I learned from the publishing process on Warp Ranger was when I first learned about trying to get the book printed, I was looking at the prices, and in order to get the book down to a price where we could actually sell it for $5 a book, I was going to have to buy at least 1,000 prints of the book, which I couldn't afford. That wasn't going to be possible. So I started asking. I went to the comic book shop. I found, and they recommended me talk to another local artist, and he recommended me to this place called Comics Wellspring out of Michigan, and that's when we were able to. I found their printing site, and that's when I could do a whole run, do a run of 300 and get it for $5 and sell it for $5 and make some sort of profit off of it, and actually make it the expected profit off of it, because you can. What happened? Most online printers that you would look for, you need to order too much. They're too expensive, and Comics Wellspring is geared for small print artists and writers, which is really nice. And they'll do graphic novels and paperbacks and things like that, or even hardcovers if you want to. Plus, they have all the convention gear if you want that as well. So I highly recommend too, if you're going to make a comic or a graphic novel, definitely talk to people like local comic book writers, find out where they're getting printing from and how they're doing it, because that will help you. They might have a resource you may not know about, and that's what saved us. And part of the reason we wanted to do this was because of this guy. The reason we went down the self-publishing route, if you recognize that character that's on the screen right now, it's probably because you were in a comic book store in the 90s, or you really like old 90s stuff. That character is a character named Cerebus. And Cerebus was a self-published comic from the 1970s all the way up to about 2000. And it was published by a guy named Dave Sim. And he was known throughout the comic industry for self-publishing. In fact, he would go to conventions and make he'd do these amazing several hundred-person panels speaking just about the importance of self-publishing and why everyone should self-publish. And basically these panels were so impressive that what would happen is people would go in just, to check out the panel or whatever, or just because they want an autograph, because they want to talk to Dave Sim and maybe get him to sign their limited edition issue of Cerebus. And then everyone would come out and want to self-publish their own book. That's how powerful he was when talking about it. And because these were so popular and so powerful, he went to one convention and for free made these things that looked like comics, but they were little zines. And they were called the Cerebus Guide to Self-Publishing. And it had everything that he talked about in his panels, including the transcription of one of his big Comic-Con panels. And he talked about why you should self-publish and he would even go through these steps 1, 2, 3 of how to self-publish your book. And Malone just happened to have that limited edition, which now if you wanted to buy one of those on Amazon right now, it ranges from $60 to $100 on Amazon right now. But you can buy a copy off Dave Sim's website for $10 if need be. But it's an amazing read. Highly recommend that too. But you read it, and he explains that a lot of people, the comic industry knows, Marvel and DC know that the people who want to work in their industry would, if they went up to them and said, hey, we can't pay you, would you do this anyway? And most people would say yes, because they want to write a Spider-Man or a Superman story or a Batman story and have their name on it. So they're happy to not give writers or artists rights to their work or whatever. So they get these amazing talents to come in and write for their characters, and then they might tell them, hey, you will give them your rights after the first 10 years, but in the contracts they have an option to pick up the rights, they have the right of first refusal, so they can choose to keep on picking it up, which they do for like books, like really big books like Watchmen or something like that, where they can just keep on getting the rights as long as it's popular. So Dave Sim talks about, this is how you publish your own book, this is how you take it to the printer, this is what you need, and then this is how you can kind of help yourself fund it in the meantime. Some of the stuff is a little dated because it's the conventions. When he wrote the book in the 90s, it seemed like the upward arc of comics was going to be unlimited, because in the 90s there was a new comic every day that they would just insert a new character, they would give zero backstory. It was just like comics were everywhere. They needed a new comic to come out every week. There was Valiant Comics, and there was Image Comics coming out, and all these different big comic companies were coming out all over the place, and there was like no end to it. And people were even sending zines in the mail to everyone. And then the internet came out, and then it kind of cut that all down. So it's not the same as when he wrote it, but a lot of his ideas behind it still apply today. And you can apply some of what he's saying to online publishing as well. You can take what he's saying about basically, if you're publishing something consistently, if you're making a comic and you publish issue 1, the next push 2, and then you 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now you make a graphic novel of 1 through 6, and then you push 7, 8, 9, and then you do 7 through 12, and then you make another graphic novel, and then you can sell all those at a convention, and now you have like a whole big backlog, and then all of those earn you rights off, like you have rights, and it might just be pennies that you're earning off of the rights, off of all of those, but it comes in over time. But it's also a lot of time making these books, and really what they say is you make a page a day, working on these pages, and then you have like the whole book collected and put it together. But that was the big thought behind it, and this is why Malone told me, don't make your Green Lantern story about Green Lantern. He said, don't sell it to DC, keep the rights, make your own character, which is, if you didn't know, Ninja Turtles. That was actually the guy Robert Kirkman was a huge fan of Daredevil. And so what he did was, he took the big Daredevil story arc at the time, where Daredevil was fighting this group of ninjas called the Hand, and then he took it and said, I'm going to have these turtles fighting this group of ninjas called the Foot, and they're going to have, instead of the Kingpin, they're going to have a Master Shredder, and that's the same. He borrowed the same storyline and just rewrote it the way he had it, and then he's doing fine. And so like it's a great, like that can be a great process, and doing it that way and having his own storyline, or like just making your own storyline, even if it's fan fiction off of a character you love. That's one way to go about it. So conventions, that was a big part of what Dave Sim talks about, and one way to go help, like a big part of making money from your own work. And I think in the 90s there's probably a lot more of the interest of people going in there for interesting comics. But the big thing that we discovered when going to conventions, they want art, they want posters, they want something they can put in a portfolio, they want someone doing really cool Stranger Things or Harry Potter or or Star Wars or some sort of like the big fan fiction universes, some cool crazy art that they can put together and hang up on their wall or put in this cool art gallery that they have and they build up. And then you reel them in with your cool art, and then you then you would have your comic to go along with it and say, hey, if you really like the art I did, my Star Wars art, then you would really like this comic that goes along with it. And a lot of time, and that was, we actually, the first time we were there, we were sitting next to someone who was very, he had been to Fan Expo Denver for years and years, and he was making the rounds that one of the comic companies was paying him for. And he actually told us, he's like, look, you need to, you see how I've got this big folder of all these these sample arts? It's you need to have that. You've got great art, but you need to have that available, and then they'll come up and then they'll buy whatever comic you have on hand. So, and then as of recently for the graphic novel, crowdfunding. For the crowdfunding, what I was learning is the big things you have to figure out from early on are, how are you going to do it? Are you going to, is it just going, where's the money going to? Is it going to just you, or are you going to have a comic business? Is it going to be, and one of the things I didn't do when setting up my graphic novel is I didn't set up the business early enough and get an EI. You need to have, if you're going on Kickstarter, which is the biggest one, the biggest crowdfunding site, then you need to have, if you're going to make it separate so that you make sure that everything is under your business, then you need to make sure your business has an EIN and it has an EIN for at least 90 days prior. Otherwise, it's not going to find it, and Kickstarter's not going to find it, and they're not going to be able to pay you. So that's a big part of it. But you can use some of these other Kickstarter ones. Right now, mine's on Chuffed, which is actually an activist-centered one. And if you have certain, if you're doing, you do a more activist-centered comic or something like that, it's a really great platform. It won't take as big of a percentage of the profits and things like that from the crowdfunding, and we'll do it. And it's easy to use, and it's a very similar setup. Honestly, all of these are similar setup. Patreon is great if you're doing, you're constantly putting out different stuff that people can get, or you want to constantly sell new issues through your site, then Patreon is a good way to do it. And I use Patreon for our criminal justice podcast, and we talk things. That's how we get support through that. But yes, so I want to make sure that we have time for questions, and I'm so what, does anyone have any questions or any topics that anyone wants to hear more about? Yeah.
Okay, so comics are one of my favorite stories on medium. So I'm just curious, why comics, the medium comic for you, not video or audio or something like that? Why comic for this content?
Okay, and I'll just repeat the question for the audience. So, why comics as the medium as opposed to video or something else? And for this project, the main reason was just because that was when it started out, that was the only medium I was working in. Eventually, I was doing, I actually started working at a media company like after the start of this, so I started working in a whole bunch of different mediums. But at that time, that was the only medium I was really working in. I was doing a lot of writing, as I said, like, so I did writing versus the comic, but what was interesting about this was I really was curious about if I could tell this story as a graphic novel. And I really wasn't sure. I really wasn't sure, and I thought it was like an interesting graphic novel prompt to see if I could do it. And I like telling stories through graphic novel in general, because a lot of the time when I'm writing, I get too focused on trying to describe a physical, like a character, or trying to describe a scene. And then in a graphic novel, I'm like, I don't have to do that. I can just be like, here's the thing, let's move on. And let's get to the actual story chunk. Who else? Yeah. Oh.
I really like the description of having to move from lightning accident to lightning crash. Were there any other words or terms or phrases you had to find yourself adjusting along the way?
All right. Were there any other phrases or anything, other terms that I had to adjust going through along the way of the graphic novel for the restorative justice aspect? And that's the biggest one, because I remember that one was hard. I think the biggest question along that, I don't think there was any word specifically like that where it was like exchange accident for crash. I think it was more of saying, like, when was I saying I? And when was I talking about me, and when was I talking about the victim's family? And also kind of it was hard because it was trying to, one aspect of it too that we're coming aware of as the novel was growing is, how do we refer to people in this? Like, and how are we referring to them? Because we don't, like, even as I'm doing this presentation, I'm trying to think, it's like we don't really want to call anyone victim, or like, that's not their only thing. Everyone has been like, they're suffering from this event, or they've been hurt by this event. And calling them a victim, or calling them a criminal, or calling them a perpetrator, that's giving them a label that might unfairly put them off into a different category and other them from everyone else. And it's hard to figure out when to use those terms so that it's not othering. And that was challenging, and I don't think we ever could, I think Deb, we didn't really dive too hard on that one. We had some grace on that, but that's a question that kind of runs through my mind a lot of times too, is when can we use those phrases, and when is it othering and saying you're a victim, and like now you're in that category.
Along those lines, it's clear that making the content is a very reflective process. How have you enabled yourself to have some flexibility without having to rewrite everything from the start? As you go about making these new discoveries and some reflection that comes out of it.
So, all right, how have I been able to be reflective and flexible throughout the process, and while having this discovery? And it's because it kind of happened in phases. So we had the storyboarding phase. So the way it went down was there was just an initial discussion with the idea of the plot, then the storyboarding, and then drawing out each individual page. And what ended up happening was the storyboard had to be kind of rewritten a couple times, and even it got rewritten in as I was drawing it. Like there was a part where I was just kind of like, okay, the storyboard initially was 60 pages that I had drawn, but I had storyboarded out, and then I'm going through, I'm like, I'm never going to be able to finish this if I do 60 pages. So I'm like, okay, I need to, where does the story actually make sense? And so I need to go through and corner it. And honestly, a lot of the stuff that got cut was stuff that was focusing too much on, I was realizing it was a lot of the language where it was me trying to justify the crash. It was trying to say, this could have happened to you, this could have happened to da-da-da. It's no, like we're going past that. We're just going right to, this is what happened. And so that's part of it. That happened, and then when so much got cut that it actually changed the story, then Deb and I had to meet, and we had to figure it out. And then she also, whenever there was something, like whenever I had made so many changes that it didn't make sense, then I could go back and go through it. It's like I would have to go through and change pages I'd already drawn out, or change, remove, rearrange. And fortunately, like I use Procreate. Procreate is a great tool for drawing and making comics, and that seems to be one of the standards that people use now. One thing that I would recommend is if you're doing a project in Procreate, always group your layers in advance, because you're going to have to go back and do that anyway, most likely. Yeah. But besides the artistic side of restorative justice, is there any other side of it? So one of the main things that they do is they actually have circles where they go through and they'll have moderators who are kind of trained in the restorative justice process, and it depends on the situation what it is. So usually the process is they will meet with a victim or a certain group of victims, and then the perpetrator or something separately, or like let's say it's an argument, and they'll meet with person A over here and person B over here, and they'll talk with them separately, and then they'll have the people involved. And they'll say, all right, you're all involved. What we're going to do is we're all going to meet on this date and this time, and we're just going to meet in a circle. And we're just going to have a circle. The moderators are going to sit somewhere in the circle, and we're just going to have a conversation. And anyone who has any thoughts, you're just going to talk, and just whatever comes up. And we're going to figure out how we can move past it, or how we can heal from whatever just happened. And that's generally the process. And this circle, it's entirely possible something happens, someone gets up and just leaves. And then what happens is end of circle, done. And then you might have to come back and do it again. And people have the freedom to leave, be hurt, have their emotions, whatever it is. But the point is that everyone gets a chance, an opportunity to speak to, and also they state beforehand, this is what I'm hoping to gain from it. This is what I'm hoping to have happen. And they might not know what they want. And the person in charge might say, well, here are some options. What do you think of all these different options? And that's, which is very different from like say just basically saying, well, we can send this person to prison for 2 to 20 years. Like, that's your only option. So it's it's trying to work together to try and see how, like, it's usually in the process, it's usually more about talking and just hearing what other people have to say and trying to get them together. And sometimes, like I said, they can't get them together, so they might record a video and just have them talking. So it doesn't necessarily have to have an artistic component at all or anything like that. But that would be the main forms of restorative justice. It also, one of the big things that a lot of restorative justice groups do is for juveniles, they'll actually have them, like if they do something, they'll actually work so that they don't get a criminal charge. They work with the person that they hurt so that they can figure out some alternative so that they don't have to get a charge and then they don't have that on their record growing up. Yes?
Do you think that restorative justice is something that
Hmm?
do you believe that restorative justice can be given to anybody, even people who have committed the most heinous of crimes?
Do I think that restorative justice can be given to anyone or used on anyone, even the most heinous crimes? And I think that it's actually, not only do I think it can be used on anyone, but I think it can be more powerful for more heinous crimes because it can have more impact. But I will qualify it by saying this. As I said before, not everyone takes responsibility for what they have done, like what they have done. And that is a key part of the restorative justice process. And it's that part of the process to enable to have healing, that's kind of like the starting point. And if people can take responsibility and kind of move and start that process, then I feel like there is a lot that someone who has caused a lot of hurt for other people to actually help them. And I say that because part of the inspiration for my graphic novel was because when I killed this family's son, and I would have done anything for this family, anything right after the accident. There is very little I would have, like if they had said, like, they want to talk to you, they want to do this, they want to do that, like I would have happily dropped everything and anything to do whatever they needed to help them in any way I could see. That wasn't an option. And what ended up happening was through the sentencing process, I ended up hurting them more. And the thought of that to this day really bothers me. And so I feel like there's a lot more that can be done if there's, like, especially for people who've done a lot of harm, if they can have a chance to work directly with those people and a restorative justice process does that in a way that is the least likely to cause damage to the people who've already been hurt. Yes.
Restorative justice is more for someone who apologizes not to their actions, but what happens for people who keep committing crimes? So I guess someone who, I don't know, does something once and then they do the restorative justice process and then they do it again. What do you do in that situation where it's they keep doing it?
There are a lot of people who end up in the restorative justice process who do end up in that situation where they do, and it's part of that. And one of the things that the moderators do a lot of time is that that's one of the first things they bring up is like, you are not taking responsibility. You have not taken responsibility for yourself in this case. And honestly, it's a case-by-case basis on how it gets handled. And it ends up being, because restorative justice is a process, really it's a community process. Because it's not up to the moderator to decide how they're going to handle it, but it's one of the first things the moderator is going to have to bring up to the community, because if the community comes up, it's like any problem. It's like if you have a leaky roof and the roof keeps on leaking in the same exact spot over time, apparently whatever's like putting tape over it isn't working. Like something more is going to have to be done. And the question is what is it, what's going to have to be done, and how is it going to need to be addressed? And that's, and the nice part is it's a community decision about how people, whatever it is, whether it's the first time or the 10th time, how is going to be done. Yes.
Tag on to that. If that's in the process of restorative justice, it being a community decision, is there room in the model of restorative justice for the community to decide that we don't want this person to exist in our community anymore? Prison.
Right.
Is there room in that process for that? Or like how does restorative justice handle that?
The question is then, yeah, and I think the question is like how, because there's going to be another, if the community decides that, or anyone in the community decides that, they're like, I don't feel comfortable with you in the community. It's like how, then the question, there's going to be the comeback of, well, what does that mean, and how is that person going to like leave it? Like how, like what does that actually end up meaning? And the other aspect is well, there's other ways that they can leave the community than necessarily going to a prison or whatever it is. So I'll couch it this way. I don't know of any, as I know a lot of people who've worked in restorative justice, and I haven't heard a situation where they've actually gotten to that point, because they usually, once again, it's usually trying to work for something that ensures that everyone is comfortable in the community. And so usually that would mean that the process is failing if people are not feeling comfortable in the community still by the end of it. There are things, if you're going to send someone outside of the community, a lot of times there are resources out there for it, but the question is, can they access them? Like, treatment is a resource. There are ways to, and like, are there help for whatever for that person so they can come back to the community and actually contribute. And one of the major issues I see in society as a whole is we don't have anything for really big issues. I feel like we don't even offer things like that. We send them out then like into a blank, like prison is just send them out and then they're going to come back, and then we don't know, like, and then we're going to hope that they're better when they come back. So these are, but like I said, the whole point, the focus from the restorative justice angle is that everyone should feel safe by the end of the process. If someone I could see someone needing to like go through some sort of treatment, getting some sort of help through the process. But since it's never been used for it's rarely used for really big issues, I don't think it gets to that point. Yes.
So what do you think would happen if victims or survivors of certain crimes were against restorative justice for people who have done horrible things to them?
Well, if they're against it, then that would stop the process from. Okay, so what would happen if a victim of a crime was against the restorative justice process? And that would basically put an end to the process from the beginning, because they couldn't have the process. It's, once again, the only way the process works is if everyone's coming in there with like trying to work it out, or hoping that or seeing if there's some way that they can work it out. And if there's no way from the start, then it's just like if someone comes in and they adamantly deny that anything even happened. And it would be difficult to do that. I will say there are people who have a lot of times for tough situations, the specialists will go in there and they will talk to him, and be like, is there any way? Like, what can we do? What could happen? What do you want? Honestly, that's usually the main thing they go when they first make contact. It's like, what do you want? What would you like to have happen? And what resources do you need? And it's not necessarily what would you like to have happen to that person. It's what do you need for you in general? What do you need? What do you need for your life? Which is not something I see offered right now. Like, I don't see prosecutors or police or anyone offering that right now. Yeah, okay. Yes.
Kind of going into like the whole the prejudice and stuff, obviously it doesn't prevent crime or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But for those that are like serial killers or people who are like deemed to be very dangerous to society, like, what is the solution for that besides prisons? Like, keep them from my question is, I guess, what would the solution be for those people that would?
Okay, so what would the solution be for people, for like serial killers, for serious offenders, other than prison? And so before I went to prison, I went to treatment. And the difference between, so treatment and prison, you both get removed from society, period. You're out, you're not living at home, your method of communication is removed. The difference between treatment and prison is that the staff in prison, their only mission is to make sure you do not leave. And they also a little bit of you need to obey whatever we're saying. The staff at a treatment facility is trying to help to ensure that you are getting the help you need so that you get better. And if we actually set up something like that so that people are actually trying to get rehabilitated wherever they go, whatever that is, because I think there will be times where people will have to be removed because there are serious problems, as you mentioned, where they'll have to come out. But if they're in a treatment type situation, instead of being removed into a situation where now they're kind of constantly having to watch their back, they're guarding themselves, it's always under threat, and there's no one, you're just basically out for yourself, period, and you're defending yourself. Then as opposed, and if you're doing that versus you're in treatment where everyone's trying to help each other and trying to help get out, then there's a chance of like healing so that when they do eventually get out, they won't do what they did again, or some other form, something else that hurts someone else when they get out. And a lot of people, part of the reason why the recidivism rate is so bad is because a lot of times one part is that when you get out, it's just like you can fail just by the conditions of just the parole conditions. And so you don't have the same conditions as a regular citizen. And then also you don't have, the money you spent on your lawyer or whatever before going into prison, you don't have anymore. Or you don't have any money or your resources, or you lost your people while you were locked up. You don't have those resources anymore. So now you come out, you've lost all of these resources, and now you've got to figure it out on your own. And it would be very challenging for anyone, whether or not they've committed a crime before or not, to just be out in the world without any of those resources. And especially if you've lived in a situation where it was like, seriously, it's hard to summarize in a very short time, but it's like I had to learn how to sneak around in prison because that's kind of the way it's designed. So I would much rather people be in a place where they learn how to be awesome citizens and learn how to help each other out. Then when they come out, it's second nature that they're helping other people out. So I think that would be the solution, but that doesn't exist right now. We have time for like one or two more questions, if anybody has any. Yeah?
Just to clarify, you mentioned the Boulder Restorative Justice Department?
It's the Boulder County Restorative Justice. They're part of they work with Boulder County Probation. They're a department within the county.
Yeah, I was just hoping to clarify where they were in relation to the probation process and the prison system.
Yeah. I really appreciate the questions, and it's very thoughtful, and I'm thankful for the questions. And honestly, yeah, I'm very thankful for your time today and everything too.
Just before you all leave real quick, I just wanted to also give a thank you to the departments on campus that helped us bring Ryan, and we'll also just thank you for Ryan. Yay, I know we just clapped, but yay. But I wanted to thank our Student Government Association, the College of Letter Arts and Sciences, Vice Chancellor of DEI, the Kramer Family Library, and the Center for Religious Diversity in Public Life. And thank you for coming to our first event. Have a great day.